The morning sun cast long shadows across downtown Minneapolis as Marcus Thompson shuffled along the sidewalk, his worn combat boots making soft scraping sounds against the concrete. His weathered backpack, containing everything he owned in the world, hung heavily from his shoulders. The autumn air was crisp, and Marcus pulled his faded military jacket tighter around his thin frame. Marcus had been living on the streets for 8 months now. The transition from decorated war hero to homeless veteran had been swift and brutal. After serving 3 tours in Afghanistan, he had returned home with invisible wounds that the outside world couldn't see or understand. The nightmares, the flashbacks, the constant state of hypervigilance. These were his companions now, more faithful than any friend had ever been. He stopped in front of First National Bank, the same spot where he had been sitting for the past 2 weeks. The bank's security guard, Officer Rodriguez, had grown accustomed to seeing Marcus there each morning. Unlike other business owners who shooed away homeless individuals, Rodriguez had served in the military himself and recognized something familiar in Marcus's bearing. The way he sat straight despite his circumstances, the alert way his eyes scanned the environment, the respectful nod he gave to anyone who made eye contact. Marcus settled onto the cold concrete steps, positioning himself where he could observe the street while staying out of the main flow of foot traffic. He pulled out a small, battered notebook and a pencil worn down to just 2 inches. Writing helped quiet the noise in his head, helped him make sense of the chaos that had become his life. The bank's morning rush was beginning. Well-dressed professionals hurried past, most avoiding eye contact, a few dropping coins into the paper cup Marcus kept beside him. He wasn't aggressive about asking for money. His military training had instilled in him a sense of dignity that poverty couldn't strip away. Instead, he simply sat quietly, occasionally offering a thank you or have a blessed day to those who acknowledged his presence. As Marcus wrote in his notebook, his mind drifted back to better times. He remembered the day he had enlisted, 18 years old, and full of purpose. His mother had cried, but she had been proud too. "You come back to us, Marcus," she had whispered as she hugged him goodbye. He had promised her he would, but the man who had returned was not the same one who had left. Afghanistan had changed everything. Marcus had been part of an elite unit tasked with some of the most dangerous missions in the region. He had seen things no human being should ever have to witness, done things that haunted his dreams and waking hours alike. But he had also saved lives, protected his fellow soldiers, and served his country with honor and distinction. The medal, the one now carefully wrapped in a cloth and buried deep in his backpack, was a reminder of one particular day when everything had gone wrong, but Marcus had somehow made it right. His unit had been ambushed while escorting a convoy of medical supplies to a remote village. The enemy fire had been intense, and Marcus had watched his best friend, Danny Martinez, take a bullet to the chest just 20 feet away from him. Without thinking, Marcus had charged through the gunfire, reaching Danny and dragging him to safety behind a destroyed vehicle. But Danny wasn't the only one hit. 3 other soldiers were trapped in the kill zone, and the enemy was closing in. Marcus had made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He had gone back. Again and again, he had run through the hail of bullets, each time bringing another wounded soldier to safety. By the time reinforcements arrived, Marcus had saved 4 lives, including Danny's. The official citation would later read that he had displayed conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty, but Marcus never felt like a hero. He felt like a man who had simply done what needed to be done. The Medal of Honor ceremony had been surreal. Standing in the White House, shaking hands with the president, listening to the citation being read aloud, it all felt like it was happening to someone else. His mother had been there, tears streaming down her face as she watched her son receive the nation's highest military honor. "I'm so proud of you, baby," she had whispered afterward, and Marcus had held onto those words like a lifeline. But heroes, Marcus had learned, were not immune to the invisible wounds of war. The nightmares had started almost immediately after his return. The guilt over the friends who hadn't made it home weighed on him constantly. He jumped at sudden noises, couldn't handle crowds, and found it impossible to relate to civilians who complained about trivial problems when he had seen real suffering and death. The Veterans Affairs system, overwhelmed and underfunded, had provided some help, but not enough. The therapy sessions felt inadequate, the medications made him feel like a zombie, and the bureaucracy was a maze he couldn't navigate while dealing with his psychological struggles. Slowly, Marcus had begun to withdraw from society. His marriage to Sarah had crumbled first. She had tried to understand, had been patient and loving, but Marcus couldn't explain what was happening inside his head. The anger, the depression, the way he would disappear mentally even when he was sitting right next to her. It was too much for their relationship to bear. The divorce papers had been signed on a rainy Tuesday morning, and Marcus had moved out that same day. The job losses came next. Despite his military experience and the respect that came with his medal, Marcus found it impossible to maintain steady employment. The nightmares left him exhausted, the hypervigilance made office environments unbearable, and the unpredictable nature of his flashbacks made him unreliable in employers' eyes. One by one, opportunities disappeared until Marcus found himself unemployed and running out of savings. The final blow had been losing his apartment. Without steady income, he couldn't make rent, and despite his landlord's initial sympathy for his situation, business was business. Marcus had packed his few remaining possessions into his backpack and walked out into a world that suddenly seemed foreign and hostile. The first night on the streets had been the longest of his life. Sitting in a 24-hour diner with a cup of coffee he made last 4 hours, Marcus had stared at his reflection in the window and wondered how he had fallen so far so fast. The man staring back at him looked like a stranger, hollow-eyed, defeated, lost. But Marcus was a survivor. His military training had taught him to adapt and overcome, and slowly, he had learned the unwritten rules of street life. He had found safe places to sleep, discovered which restaurants threw away edible food, and learned which areas of the city were most tolerant of homeless individuals. The bank steps had become his daytime sanctuary, a place where he could maintain some semblance of routine and dignity. Officer Rodriguez emerged from the bank and walked over to where Marcus sat. "Morning, Marcus," he said, his voice carrying genuine warmth. "How are you holding up?" Marcus looked up from his notebook and managed a small smile. "Morning, Officer Rodriguez. Doing all right. Thank you for asking." It was their daily ritual, a small moment of human connection that meant more to Marcus than Rodriguez could know. "Supposed to get cold tonight," Rodriguez said, glancing at the gray clouds gathering overhead. "You got somewhere warm to stay?" Marcus nodded. He had discovered an abandoned building a few blocks away where several homeless veterans had set up an informal shelter. It wasn't much, but it kept the wind and rain out. "I'll be fine. Thank you for your concern." Rodriguez studied Marcus's face for a moment. Despite the circumstances, there was something about this man that commanded respect. The way he spoke, the way he carried himself, the quiet dignity he maintained despite his situation. Rodriguez had seen many homeless individuals over the years, but Marcus was different. "You know," Rodriguez said carefully, "I've been meaning to ask, were you military? Something about you reminds me of my old unit." Marcus's hand instinctively moved to his backpack, where the medal lay hidden. He had told no one about his service, partly out of shame about his current situation and partly because he didn't want pity. But there was something trustworthy about Rodriguez, something that reminded Marcus of the good officers he had served under. "Army," Marcus said simply. "3 tours in Afghanistan." Rodriguez nodded with understanding. "Marines myself. 2 tours in Iraq." He paused, then added, "I know it's not easy, the transition back. If you ever need anything, information about services, someone to talk to, you let me know, okay?" Before Marcus could respond, the sound of screeching tires filled the air. A black sedan had pulled up to the curb directly in front of the bank, and 3 men were getting out. Marcus's combat-trained mind immediately assessed the situation. The men were dressed too heavily for the weather, moved with purpose rather than the casual gait of customers, and one was scanning the street in a pattern Marcus recognized as tactical awareness. "Rodriguez," Marcus said quietly, his voice taking on an urgency that made the security guard immediately alert. "Those 3 men getting out of the car, something's not right." Rodriguez turned to look just as the men reached the bank's entrance. 2 of them had their hands inside their jackets, and the third was pulling something from a large bag. Marcus's adrenaline spiked as he recognized the unmistakable outline of weapons being concealed. "Call for backup," Marcus whispered urgently to Rodriguez. Now, as Rodriguez reached for his radio, the three men disappeared into the bank. Marcus could hear his heart pounding in his ears, the familiar sound that had accompanied him through countless dangerous situations overseas. Every instinct honed by years of combat was screaming at him that violence was about to unfold. Inside the bank, Mrs. Chun was making her weekly deposit for her small restaurant. She had been coming to this branch for 15 years, and the tellers knew her by name. Today, she was particularly cheerful because her grandson had just been accepted to college, the first in their family to achieve such an honor. Behind her in line stood James Morrison, a young father of two who was depositing his paycheck and trying to calculate whether they could afford new winter coats for his children. He was tired from working double shifts at the factory, but the overtime pay would help them get through the month. At the counter, teller Sarah Williams was helping an elderly gentleman with a complicated transaction involving his retirement funds. Sarah had been working at the bank for just 6 months, and she genuinely enjoyed helping customers navigate their financial needs. She was planning to use her lunch break to shop for a birthday present for her daughter. None of them saw the three men enter. None of them noticed the way the men positioned themselves strategically around the lobby. None of them were prepared for what happened next. The first gunshot shattered the peaceful morning routine like thunder splitting a clear sky. The gunshot echoed through the bank lobby, followed immediately by a commanding voice shouting, "Everyone on the ground. Now, this is a robbery." Chaos erupted as customers and employees dropped to the floor, some screaming, others too shocked to make any sound at all. Outside, Marcus felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that had kept him alive through countless firefights. His mind shifted into the tactical mode that had saved his life and the lives of his fellow soldiers more times than he could count. While his body remained motionless on the bank steps, his brain was rapidly processing information and formulating a plan. Officer Rodriguez had gone rigid beside him, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon. "I'm calling for backup," he whispered into his radio, but Marcus could see the conflict in the security guard's eyes. Rodriguez knew that by the time help arrived, the situation inside could already be over, and not necessarily with a positive outcome. Through the large windows, Marcus could see figures moving inside the bank. The gunman who appeared to be the leader was gesturing with his weapon while shouting orders. Marcus counted at least 15 potential hostages, customers, and employees who had been going about their normal day until violence shattered their world. "How many entrances does the bank have?" Marcus asked Rodriguez quietly, his military training taking over. "Main entrance we're looking at, employee entrance on the north side, and an emergency exit in the back that only opens from the inside," Rodriguez replied, recognizing the tactical nature of Marcus's question. "Why? What are you thinking?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. His mind was racing through possibilities, calculating risks, remembering similar situations he had faced in Afghanistan where civilian lives had hung in the balance. The difference was that in Afghanistan, he had been armed and had backup. Here, he was just a homeless veteran with nothing but his training and his determination to prevent innocent people from getting hurt. Inside the bank, the lead robber was a man named Vincent Kowalski, a career criminal who had spent more years in prison than out of it. This was supposed to be his final score, the robbery that would set him up for retirement in a country without extradition treaties. He had planned it meticulously, studying the bank's routines, identifying the optimal time when cash reserves would be highest, but security would be minimal. Vincent's two accomplices, Tommy Russo and Derek Chun, were younger and more nervous. Tommy kept shifting his weight from foot to foot, his grip on his weapon unsteady. Derek was supposed to be watching the door, but he kept glancing back at the hostages, clearly uncomfortable with the terror written on their faces. "You," Vincent barked at Sarah Williams, the young teller who was now trembling behind the counter. "Fill these bags with everything in your drawers. No die packs, no silent alarms, or I start shooting customers. You understand me?" Sarah nodded frantically, her hands shaking as she began pulling money from her cash drawer. She kept thinking about her daughter, wondering if she would ever see her again. The bank's silent alarm had already been triggered. Standard procedure required it to activate automatically whenever the vault was accessed without the proper sequence. But Sarah didn't know if help would arrive in time. Mrs. Chin lay on the cold marble floor, her weekly deposit scattered around her. She was praying silently in Mandarin, the same prayers her grandmother had taught her as a child. Beside her, James Morrison was thinking about his wife and children, making silent promises to God about the kind of father and husband he would be if he survived this ordeal. Vincent had done his research on response times. He knew that in this part of the city, police backup would take at least 8 to 12 minutes to arrive in force. His plan was to be in and out in under 6 minutes, leaving plenty of buffer time. What he hadn't counted on was the homeless veteran sitting on the steps outside, a man whose entire military career had been built around adapting to unexpected circumstances. Marcus stood slowly, his movements deliberate and measured. Rodriguez looked at him with alarm, recognizing the expression on Marcus's face. It was the look of a soldier preparing for battle. "Marcus, what are you doing?" Rodriguez whispered urgently. "We need to wait for backup. You can't go in there unarmed." "Those people don't have 8 minutes," Marcus replied quietly. "I've been in situations like this before. If we wait, people are going to die." Rodriguez grabbed Marcus's arm. "You're not in Afghanistan anymore. This isn't your fight." Marcus turned to look at the security guard, and Rodriguez saw something in his eyes that made him release his grip. It was the look of a man who had faced death before and had always chosen to stand between danger and innocent people, regardless of the personal cost. "It became my fight the moment they pointed guns at civilians," Marcus said simply. Inside the bank, Vincent was growing impatient. The teller was moving too slowly, and he could see that some of the hostages were beginning to recover from their initial shock. That was dangerous. Shocked people were predictable, but people who started thinking might try to be heroes. "Faster!" he screamed at Sarah, firing a shot into the ceiling to emphasize his point. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space, and several customers began sobbing. "I want every drawer emptied now." Tommy was supposed to be covering the customers, but his attention kept drifting. He was high on methamphetamine, which made him unpredictable and dangerous. Derek, meanwhile, was having second thoughts about the entire operation. He had agreed to drive the getaway car, not to terrorize innocent people with loaded weapons. Marcus had circled around to the side of the building, moving with the fluid stealth that had made him legendary among his unit in Afghanistan. He found the employee entrance Rodriguez had mentioned, a heavy steel door that was typically kept locked during business hours. Marcus examined the lock and the door frame, his mind automatically calculating the best way to gain entry. The door was solid, but the frame was older construction. Marcus had learned in the military that sometimes the most direct approach was the most effective. He positioned himself and delivered a powerful kick just beside the lock mechanism. The door sprang open with a sharp crack that was masked by another gunshot from inside the bank. Marcus slipped inside, finding himself in a hallway that led to the main lobby. He could hear Vincent shouting orders and demands, could hear the terrified whimpers of the hostages. The sound transported him instantly back to Afghanistan, to a dozen similar situations where he had been the only thing standing between innocent civilians and armed insurgents. Moving carefully down the hallway, Marcus reached a position where he could observe the main lobby without being seen. He quickly assessed the situation. 3 armed robbers, approximately 15 hostages, one clear leader giving orders while 2 nervous accomplices tried to maintain control. It was a tactical scenario he had faced before, though the setting was dramatically different. Vincent had moved to the vault area and was screaming at the bank manager, demanding that he open the time-lock safe. The manager, a mild-mannered man named Robert Kim, was trying to explain that the vault was on a time delay and couldn't be opened until the next business day, but Vincent wasn't interested in explanations. "I don't care about your time locks," Vincent shouted, pressing his gun against Robert's temple. "Figure it out, or I start executing hostages one by one until you remember how to open it." Marcus saw the terror in Robert's eyes and knew that the situation was escalating toward deadly violence. In his experience, the longer these situations dragged on, the more likely they were to end badly. Vincent was clearly desperate and unstable, exactly the kind of criminal who would carry out his threats. Tommy was pacing near the front windows, occasionally glancing outside. He was so focused on watching for police that he failed to notice Marcus moving through the shadows at the edge of the lobby. Derek was standing near a group of hostages, his weapon pointed downward, clearly the least committed of the 3 robbers. Marcus had been in enough combat situations to know that timing was everything. He needed to wait for the right moment, when he could take action that would neutralize the immediate threat without putting the hostages at greater risk. His military training had taught him patience, how to wait for the optimal opportunity even when every instinct screamed at him to act. That moment came when Vincent became completely focused on the vault, screaming at the bank manager while Derek moved away from the hostages to check on his leader. For just a few seconds, Tommy was the only robber actively watching the hostages, and his attention was divided between them and the street outside. Marcus moved with the silent precision that had made him one of the most effective soldiers in his unit. He crossed the lobby in 3 quick steps, staying low and using the customer service counters for cover. Tommy never saw him coming. Marcus tackled Tommy from behind, one hand wrapping around the robber's gun hand to control the weapon while the other arm went around his throat in a sleeper hold. Tommy tried to shout a warning, but Marcus's grip on his throat reduced it to a strangled gasp. Within seconds, Tommy was unconscious, his weapon secured in Marcus's hands. Derek spun around at the sound of the brief struggle, raising his gun toward Marcus and the unconscious Tommy. But Derek hesitated. He had never actually shot anyone before, and the sight of the homeless man he had barely noticed outside the bank now holding Tommy's weapon threw him into confusion. That hesitation cost him. Marcus rolled away from Tommy's body and came up in a combat crouch, the captured weapon trained on Derek with the steady grip of someone who had fired thousands of rounds in training and combat. "Drop your weapon," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of a trained soldier. "Drop it now, and nobody gets hurt." Derek looked into Marcus's eyes and saw something that terrified him more than any threat Vincent had ever made. This wasn't some desperate civilian trying to be a hero. This was a predator, someone who had killed before and would do it again if necessary. Derek's gun clattered to the floor, and he raised his hands in surrender. Vincent finally realized that something had gone wrong when he turned around and saw Derek with his hands up and Marcus holding a gun on him. Vincent's face twisted with rage as he pressed his weapon harder against Robert's head. "You made a big mistake, hero," Vincent snarled at Marcus. "Drop that gun or I blow this man's brains out right here." Marcus didn't move, didn't blink, didn't show any sign of the fear that Vincent had expected to see. Instead, he spoke in the same calm, measured tone that had gotten him through countless life-or-death situations. "You're surrounded," Marcus said, which wasn't entirely true but sounded convincing. "Police are outside, your partners are down, and your only way out is through me. The smart play is to put down your weapon and surrender." Vincent laughed, but there was hysteria in the sound. "Surrounded? By who? One homeless bum who got lucky? I don't think so." Marcus could see that Vincent was beyond reason, high on adrenaline and desperation. These were the most dangerous moments in any tactical situation, when a cornered criminal realized that their plan had failed and they had nothing left to lose. Marcus had seen it before, the wild look in a man's eyes when he decided that if he was going down, he was taking as many people with him as possible. "Look around you," Marcus said calmly. "Your partners are finished. The money's not worth dying for. Just put the gun down, and we can all walk away from this." Vincent's grip tightened on his weapon, and Marcus saw the subtle change in the man's posture that indicated he was about to make his move. In that split second, Marcus had to make the kind of decision that had defined his military career: risk everything to save innocent lives, knowing that failure would mean death for himself and others. Time seemed to slow as Vincent began to swing his gun toward Marcus, using Robert as a human shield. Marcus could see the fear in the hostages' eyes, could hear Mrs. Chun whispering prayers, could feel the weight of all their lives resting on his shoulders. It was exactly like Afghanistan, except this time, he was fighting for strangers in his own country, people who had probably walked past him on the street without a second glance. But that didn't matter to Marcus. A life was a life, and he had sworn an oath long ago to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The shot rang out in the enclosed space of the bank lobby, sharp and final. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, everyone froze. Then, Vincent Kowalski crumpled to the ground, his weapon clattering across the marble floor as he clutched his shoulder, screaming in pain and rage. Marcus had taken the shot with surgical precision, the kind of marksmanship that came from years of training and combat experience. He had aimed for Vincent's gun arm, disabling the threat without killing the man. It was the same controlled violence that had earned him commendations in Afghanistan, the ability to use exactly the amount of force necessary, no more and no less. Robert Kim, the bank manager, stumbled away from Vincent's fallen form, alive and unharmed. The hostages began to sob with relief, some covering their faces with their hands, others just staring in disbelief at the homeless man who had become their unlikely savior. "Stay down," Marcus commanded Vincent, keeping the gun trained on him while moving to secure Derek, who remained motionless with his hands raised. "You move, and the next shot won't be in your shoulder." Vincent was writhing on the floor, alternating between curses and moans of pain. His shoulder was bleeding heavily, but the wound wasn't life-threatening. Marcus had seen enough combat injuries to know that Vincent would survive, though he would need medical attention soon. The sound of sirens was growing louder outside as police units finally began arriving on scene. Officer Rodriguez burst through the front door with his weapon drawn, followed by 2 city police officers. They stopped short when they saw the scene before them. The homeless veteran they had known as a quiet, harmless man, now standing over 2 disabled gunmen with a weapon in his hands. "Marcus," Rodriguez called out cautiously. "Are you okay? Is everyone safe?" Marcus slowly lowered his weapon, then carefully placed it on the counter with his hands visible. He knew how these situations could go wrong, how an armed man, even a hero, could be misidentified as a threat by responding officers. 2 suspects down, 1 wounded, and needs medical attention, Marcus reported in the crisp, professional tone he had used countless times in military debriefings. "Third suspect is unconscious near the front door. All hostages appear unharmed." The police officers moved swiftly to secure the scene, calling for paramedics and beginning to separate witnesses for interviews. Mrs. Chin was helped to her feet by a young officer, her hands still shaking but her eyes clear with gratitude as she looked at Marcus. James Morrison gathered up his scattered paycheck, his mind still processing the fact that he was alive and would be going home to his family. Sarah Williams, the teller who had been forced to empty the cash drawers, couldn't stop crying, tears of relief mixed with the delayed shock of trauma. She kept looking at Marcus as if she couldn't quite believe that this quiet, shabby man had saved all their lives. Detective Linda Martinez arrived 10 minutes later, a 15-year veteran of the force who had seen her share of bank robberies and hostage situations. She was known for her thorough investigations and her ability to piece together exactly what had happened in chaotic situations like this one. "I need to understand what happened here," Detective Martinez said, approaching Marcus, who was now sitting on one of the customer chairs, looking remarkably calm for someone who had just been in a gunfight. "The witnesses are saying you took down 3 armed robbers by yourself. That true?" Marcus nodded quietly. "I saw them entering the bank, recognized they were armed, and made a decision to intervene when it became clear that hostages were in immediate danger." "You military?" Martinez asked, though something about Marcus's bearing had already answered the question for her. "Army. Recently discharged," Marcus replied, which was technically true if 8 months could be considered recent. Martinez studied Marcus's face, noting the hollow cheeks and weathered skin that spoke of time spent outdoors, but also the steady eyes and calm demeanor that suggested this wasn't his first experience with violence. Something didn't add up about this man, but she couldn't put her finger on what it was. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" Martinez asked. "That was a hell of a shot you took, disabling the gunman without hitting the hostage he was using as a shield." "Standard military training," Marcus said simply, not wanting to elaborate on his specialized background. But Officer Rodriguez, who had been listening to the conversation, stepped forward. "Detective, I think there's more to Marcus's story than he's telling you. I've been watching him for weeks, and there's something about him that's different. Military bearing, tactical awareness, the way he assessed the threat immediately. This wasn't luck or basic training." Marcus felt uncomfortable with the attention, with the questions that were starting to probe areas he preferred to keep private. He had spent months trying to remain invisible, to avoid exactly this kind of scrutiny. The Medal of Honor in his backpack felt like it was burning a hole through the canvas. As the questioning continued, word of the foiled robbery began to spread. Local news crews started arriving on the scene, drawn by reports of a dramatic hostage situation that had ended with a homeless man single-handedly stopping three armed robbers. Reporter Jennifer Walsh from Channel 7 News was the first to arrive, her camera crew already filming the bank exterior and the police activity. "This is an incredible story," Jennifer said to her cameraman as they set up for a live broadcast. According to witnesses, a homeless veteran took down three armed bank robbers and saved 15 hostages. "We need to find this guy and get his story." Inside the bank, Marcus was becoming increasingly agitated as the scope of the attention became clear. Through the windows, he could see news vans arriving, reporters talking to witnesses, cameras being set up for broadcasts. This was exactly what he had been trying to avoid: public attention, questions about his background, scrutiny of his current situation. Detective Martinez had finished her initial interview and was reviewing her notes when one of the wounded bank manager, Robert Kim, approached her. He had been treated by paramedics for shock, but was otherwise unharmed. "Detective," Robert said quietly, "I don't know if this matters, but when that man was talking to the robber, when he was trying to get him to surrender, there was something about the way he spoke. It wasn't like someone who had just basic military training. He sounded like someone who had been in command, someone who was used to high-pressure situations." Martinez nodded, making additional notes. The more she heard about Marcus, the more convinced she became that there was a significant story behind his current circumstances. She had dealt with plenty of homeless veterans over the years, and, while many had military training, the level of tactical proficiency Marcus had displayed was extraordinary. Tommy Russo had regained consciousness and was being treated for the injuries he had sustained when Marcus took him down. He was groggy and disoriented, but coherent enough to answer basic questions. "That guy came out of nowhere," Tommy mumbled to the detective interviewing him. "One second I was watching the door, the next second I'm on the ground, and he's got my gun. I've been in fights before, but I never saw anything like that. Moved like some kind of special forces guy or something." Derek Chun, who had surrendered without resistance, was more cooperative with police. He confirmed that the robbery had been Vincent's plan and that he had been recruited as a driver, not expecting the level of violence that had ensued. "When that homeless guy told me to drop my gun," Derek said, "I looked in his eyes, and I knew he wasn't bluffing. There was something there, something that said he had killed before and wouldn't hesitate to do it again if necessary. I've known some dangerous people in my time, but this guy was on a different level entirely." Vincent Kowalski, despite his wound, was defiant and angry as paramedics prepared to transport him to the hospital under police guard. But even he grudgingly acknowledged Marcus's skill. "I don't know who that guy is," Vincent told Detective Martinez, "but he's no ordinary homeless bum. The way he moved, the way he took that shot, that's professional training. Military, maybe special forces. You don't learn to do what he did in basic training." As the afternoon wore on, the media attention continued to grow. The story of a homeless veteran stopping a bank robbery was exactly the kind of human interest story that captured public attention. Jennifer Walsh had managed to interview several of the hostages, and their accounts painted Marcus as a genuine hero. "He saved all our lives," Mrs. Chun told the camera, her voice still shaky with emotion. "I thought I was going to die in there, thought I would never see my grandson graduate from college. That man risked everything to protect people he didn't even know." James Morrison was equally effusive in his praise. "I've got two little kids at home, and I was thinking I might never see them again. Then, this guy appears like some kind of guardian angel and takes down all three robbers. He's a real hero, doesn't matter what his circumstances are now." But Marcus wasn't interested in being anyone's hero. As the police interviews concluded and the initial chaos began to settle, he tried to quietly slip away from the scene. He had done what needed to be done, the threat had been neutralized, and now he just wanted to return to his anonymous existence on the streets. Officer Rodriguez caught up with him as Marcus was walking away from the bank. "Marcus, wait up. Where are you going?" "Back to my spot," Marcus replied simply. "This is over now. People are safe, the bad guys are caught. Time for me to go." Rodriguez shook his head. "Marcus, you can't just walk away from this. You're a hero. The media wants to talk to you. The mayor's office has already called asking about you. This could change everything for you." Marcus stopped walking and turned to face Rodriguez. "I didn't do this to be a hero or to get attention. I did it because people were in danger, and I had the skills to help them. That's all. But don't you see? Rodriguez pressed. This could be your way back. People will want to help you after this. You could get services, housing, medical care. You don't have to live on the streets anymore. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, considering Rodriguez's words. Part of him was tempted by the possibility of returning to a normal life, of having a roof over his head and regular meals. But another part of him, the part that had been broken by war and loss, wasn't ready to believe that things could really change. I appreciate the thought, Marcus said finally. But I've learned not to count on things that seem too good to be true. People's attention spans are short. Next week, there will be another story, and everyone will forget about the homeless veteran who stopped a bank robbery. Rodriguez wanted to argue, but he could see the resignation in Marcus's eyes. This was a man who had been disappointed too many times, who had learned to protect himself by expecting nothing from others. As Marcus walked away from the bank, the weight of his backpack, and the metal hidden inside it, seemed heavier than ever. He had been trained to be a protector, a guardian of the innocent, and that training had served him well today. But he still didn't know how to protect himself from the demons that haunted his own mind. The sun was beginning to set as Marcus made his way through the downtown streets, the sound of sirens and news helicopters fading behind him. Tomorrow, he knew, his face would be on television and in newspapers. The homeless veteran who had saved the day would be a story that people talked about over breakfast and coffee. But Marcus also knew something that the public didn't. Heroes could fall just as far as anyone else. The medal in his backpack was proof of that. He had been honored at the White House, celebrated as a national hero, and then forgotten by the same society that had once cheered for him. As he settled into his sleeping spot for the night in the abandoned building he shared with other homeless veterans, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that his carefully constructed invisible existence was about to change dramatically. The bank robbery had forced him back into the spotlight he had been trying so hard to avoid. What Marcus didn't know was that Jennifer Walsh, the persistent reporter from Channel 7, had already begun digging into his background. Something about his story didn't add up, and her journalistic instincts told her there was more to this homeless veteran than met the eye. Jennifer Walsh had built her reputation on uncovering stories that others missed, on finding the human truth behind the headlines. The homeless veteran bank hero story felt incomplete to her, like a puzzle with crucial pieces missing. Something about Marcus Thompson's extraordinary tactical skills and calm professionalism during the robbery suggested there was much more to his military background than he was revealing. She spent the evening after the robbery making phone calls to her contacts in the military and veteran affairs community, trying to piece together Marcus's service record. Most of her sources couldn't provide specific information due to privacy regulations, but the hints she gathered painted a picture of someone who had served with distinction in highly classified operations. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Jennifer's uncle, Colonel William Walsh, was a retired Army officer who had served in Afghanistan during the same period Marcus would have been deployed. When Jennifer described the tactical proficiency Marcus had displayed, her uncle's response was immediate and telling. "The way you're describing this man's actions," Colonel Walsh said over the phone, "that's not standard infantry training. The precision shooting, the tactical assessment, the way he handled a complex hostage situation, that's special operations level stuff. Elite units only." Jennifer felt her investigative instincts sharpen. "Is there any way you could help me find out more about him? His name is Marcus Thompson, served 3 tours in Afghanistan." There was a long pause before her uncle responded. "Jennifer, if this man is who I think he might be, you need to be very careful how you handle this story. Some of these guys have been through things that would break most people. They deserve respect, not exploitation." The next morning, Marcus's picture was indeed on the front page of every local newspaper and had been featured on the morning news broadcasts. The headline in the Minneapolis Tribune read, "Homeless Hero Stops Bank Robbery," accompanied by a photo taken by a bystander showing Marcus calmly holding the surrendered weapon after disabling Vincent Kowalski. Marcus saw the newspaper in a coffee shop window as he made his morning rounds, and the sight made his stomach clench with anxiety. This was exactly what he had feared, his face plastered across the media, his story becoming public property, his carefully guarded privacy stripped away. He decided to avoid his usual spot at the bank and instead found a secluded corner of a nearby park where he could think. But even there, he couldn't escape the attention. Several people recognized him from the news coverage and approached to shake his hand and offer congratulations. While their intentions were good, Marcus found the interaction overwhelming and disorienting. Dr. Patricia Williams, a psychologist who specialized in treating combat veterans with PTSD, saw the news coverage and immediately recognized the signs of a man struggling with invisible wounds. She had treated hundreds of veterans over the years and knew that heroic actions often came from soldiers who were battling their own demons. Dr. Williams made some phone calls to veteran advocacy organizations, trying to find out if anyone was providing support for Marcus. What she discovered troubled her. Despite his obvious need for mental health services and housing assistance, Marcus had fallen through the cracks of a system that was supposed to help veterans transition back to civilian life. Meanwhile, Jennifer Walsh's investigation was yielding remarkable results. Through careful research and discreet inquiries, she had uncovered fragments of Marcus's true military record. What she found made her realize that the man living homeless on the streets of Minneapolis was one of the most decorated combat veterans of the Afghanistan War. Her uncle had been able to confirm, through unofficial channels, that Marcus Thompson was indeed a recipient of the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration awarded by the United States government. He had been part of an elite unit that conducted some of the most dangerous operations of the war, operations that were still largely classified. Jennifer knew she had stumbled onto one of the biggest stories of her career, but her uncle's words about respect and exploitation echoed in her mind. This wasn't just a story about a homeless veteran. This was a story about how the nation's highest military hero had ended up living on the streets, forgotten and ignored by the same society that had once celebrated his heroism. Marcus spent the day trying to avoid the media attention, but it was impossible. News crews were stationed near the bank, hoping to catch him returning to his usual spot. Reporters were asking other homeless individuals if they knew where to find him. The quiet anonymity he had worked so hard to maintain was completely shattered. As evening approached, Marcus reluctantly returned to the abandoned building where he had been staying. To his surprise, he found Officer Rodriguez waiting for him, along with Dr. Williams and a woman he didn't recognize who introduced herself as Jennifer Walsh from Channel 7 News. "Marcus," Rodriguez said gently, "I know you don't want to talk to reporters, but Jennifer here has found out some things about your background that we think you should know about." Marcus's immediate instinct was to flee, but something about the serious expressions on their faces made him stay. Jennifer stepped forward, her manner respectful but direct. "Mr. Thompson," she said, "I've been researching your military service, and I've discovered that you're a recipient of the Medal of Honor. Is that correct?" Marcus felt as if the world had stopped spinning. For months, he had guarded this secret, this reminder of a time when he had been someone other than a homeless man ignored by society. Now, confronted directly with the truth, he found himself unable to deny it. Slowly, Marcus nodded his head. "Yes," he said quietly. "That's correct." The confirmation hung in the air like a thunderbolt. Dr. Williams, who had suspected something like this from the tactical precision Marcus had displayed during the robbery, felt her heart break for this man who had given everything in service to his country only to be abandoned when he needed help most. Jennifer had prepared for this moment, but the reality of standing in front of the nation's highest military hero while he lived in an abandoned building was more powerful than she had expected. This wasn't just a news story, this was a national tragedy. "Mr. Thompson," Jennifer said carefully, "would you be willing to tell me how you went from receiving the Medal of Honor to living on the streets? I think people need to understand how our veterans are being failed by the system." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with emotions he had been suppressing for months. Part of him wanted to retreat back into anonymity, to refuse to engage with the media circus that was building around him. But another part of him, the part that had always fought for others, recognized an opportunity to speak for veterans who didn't have a voice. "If I tell my story," Marcus said finally, "it's not for sympathy or to make excuses. It's so people understand that what happened to me is happening to thousands of other veterans. The medals and ceremonies don't protect you from the invisible wounds of war." Jennifer nodded, understanding the weight of what Marcus was offering. This wasn't just an interview. This was a chance to shed light on a crisis that affected thousands of American veterans. Over the next hour, Marcus told his story. He spoke about his service in Afghanistan, about the firefight that had earned him the Medal of Honor, about the pride he had felt standing in the White House receiving recognition from his commander-in-chief. But he also spoke about the nightmares, the guilt, the way the trauma of war had slowly eroded his ability to function in civilian society. He described his marriage falling apart, the job losses, the frustrating bureaucracy of the VA system that was supposed to help him but instead became another source of stress and disappointment. He talked about the shame of losing his apartment, the terror of his first night on the streets, and the way society seemed to look right through homeless veterans as if they didn't exist. Dr. Williams listened with professional attention, recognizing the classic symptoms of severe PTSD in Marcus's account. She knew that his case was far from unique. Thousands of combat veterans struggled with similar issues, many of them ending up homeless despite their service and sacrifice. "The system is broken," Marcus said, his voice carrying the weight of painful experience. "We send young men and women to war. We celebrate them when they perform heroically, and then we abandon them when they come home broken. The medals don't pay for therapy. The ceremonies don't cure nightmares." As Marcus spoke, Jennifer realized that this story was much bigger than a bank robbery. This was about the fundamental failure of American society to care for its veterans, about the disconnect between honoring service in the abstract and providing concrete support for those who had sacrificed everything. "What happened yesterday at the bank," Marcus continued, "that was just my training taking over. I saw people in danger, and I acted on instinct. But afterwards, when everyone was calling me a hero, all I could think about was how ironic it was. Here I am, supposedly a hero again, but tomorrow I'll still be sleeping in an abandoned building." Rodriguez had been listening quietly, but now he spoke up. "Marcus, it doesn't have to be that way. What happened yesterday has gotten people's attention. There are organizations that want to help, people who are offering housing and services." Marcus looked skeptical. "And how long will that last? Until the next news cycle? I've learned not to depend on other people's good intentions. They tend to fade when the cameras go away." But Jennifer had been thinking beyond just the immediate story. She recognized that Marcus's situation represented an opportunity to create lasting change, not just temporary charity. "What if this time was different?" Jennifer asked. "What if we used the attention from your story to highlight the broader crisis facing homeless veterans? What if we made this about more than just you?" Marcus considered this possibility. Throughout his military career, he had always been focused on the mission rather than personal recognition. The idea of using his situation to help other veterans appealed to the part of him that had always fought for others. "If my story can help other veterans get the support they need," Marcus said slowly, "then maybe something good can come out of this." Dr. Williams leaned forward. "Marcus, I want you to know that there are effective treatments for PTSD now. Things have improved significantly since you first left the service. With proper therapy and medication, you can recover from this. The trauma doesn't have to define the rest of your life." For the first time since the conversation had begun, Marcus allowed himself to feel a small spark of hope. He had convinced himself that his situation was permanent, that the damage done by war was irreversible. The possibility that healing might be possible was both terrifying and liberating. Jennifer's story about Marcus ran as a three-part series that dominated the news cycle for the following week. The first part focused on the bank robbery and Marcus's heroic actions. The second part revealed his Medal of Honor background and traced his path from the White House to the streets. The third part examined the broader crisis of veteran homelessness and the systemic failures that allowed decorated war heroes to fall through the cracks. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. The mayor's office was flooded with calls demanding action on veteran services. The VA hospital received hundreds of inquiries about programs for homeless veterans. Local businesses and organizations began offering housing, employment, and medical services specifically for veterans in need. But, perhaps most importantly, Marcus's story connected with other homeless veterans who had been struggling in silence and shame. They began reaching out to service organizations, encouraged by the fact that even a Medal of Honor recipient had faced similar challenges and was now seeking help. Marcus eventually accepted an offer of temporary housing from a veteran service organization while he began intensive therapy for his PTSD. The road to recovery was difficult and sometimes discouraging, but for the first time in months, he had hope for the future. 6 months later, Marcus stood before the city council as an advocate for homeless veteran services, using his experience and his story to push for concrete policy changes. The metal that had once felt like a burden was now a tool he used to open doors and force people to listen to the needs of forgotten veterans. The bank robbery had lasted only minutes, but its impact on Marcus's life and on the broader conversation about veteran care continued to ripple outward, creating opportunities for healing and change that he had never imagined possible.